Imagine working alone at 1 a.m., surrounded by nothing but darkness and the distant hum of insects, when suddenly the sky lights up. A bright red light, growing, moving, heading straight for you. Your tractor dies, and before you can even react, you're no longer in control. This isn't just any UFO story. This is the first documented alien abduction, and it happened to a man named Antonio Villas Boas.
And trust me, it gets even stranger than you can possibly imagine. The year was 1957.
October 15th, to be exact. 11 days after Sputnik launched. While the world's attention was fixed on the heavens for one reason, something else was taking place in the remote farmlands of Brazil. Before we dive deeper, you need to understand who Antonio Villas Boas was. Not just another name in a case file. At 23, he'd already shouldered the weight of his family's future. His father had died the previous year, leaving Antonio, the second oldest of 4 sons, to help manage their modest farm. He had no formal education beyond elementary school, no exposure to science fiction magazines, no interest in space or aliens. Just calloused hands and the quiet determination of a young man who woke each morning before dawn to work the land his family depended on. The red soil of Minas Gerais clung to everything, his boots, his clothes, beneath his fingernails. That same distinctive soil would later be inexplicably found embedded in wounds that appeared on his body after the encounter, a detail investigators couldn't explain. Here's where most people completely misunderstand this case. The Villas Boas encounter wasn't just another UFO sighting. It was a contact event that predates nearly every abduction narrative that would later become part of our cultural consciousness. I've spent the past month researching this case, and I can't help but feel for Antonio. Now, put yourself in his shoes. If you were a 23-year-old farmer with no exposure to sci-fi, could you, on your own, create a story so detailed, so precise, that it would go on to predict the next 60 years of UFO encounters?
Keep that question in mind. It becomes important later.
Now, let's set the scene properly. São Francisco de Sales, Brazil, approximately 490 kilometers northwest of Sao Paulo, October 15th, 1957. Pull back and see what Antonio saw that night. The vast open field stretching toward the horizon, the night sky unaffected by light pollution, stars scattered like diamond dust against black velvet, the air carrying the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and early morning dew beginning to form. Antonio was alone on his tractor, a recently purchased Fordson Major that represented a significant investment for the family.
It's here. Be first. It's here. Be first. The new Fordson Major in the super class.
The engine's steady rumble and the headlights cutting yellow paths through the darkness were his only companions as he worked his family's fields to avoid the punishing daytime heat. Antonio had seen strange lights before. Twice in the previous weeks, he and his brother had witnessed unusual illuminations in the night sky. They discussed it briefly, then returned to the endless demands of farm life. When you're responsible for your family's livelihood, even the extraordinary takes a backseat to necessity. What happened next changed everything. Antonio spotted what appeared to be a red star growing larger in the night sky. The star moved, growing brighter as it descended. Then it stopped. A complete cessation of movement from high velocity, hovering approximately 50 meters above the field. The tractor died, not just stalled, completely dead. The engine, the lights, everything. Surrounded by darkness, Antonio did what most of us would do. He tried to restart it, desperately turning the key as a bright light bathed the field around him in an unnatural glow. That's when fear hit him. Not a mild anxiety, but that primal gut-level recognition that something fundamental in your world has shifted. His heart pounded in his throat. His mouth went dry. Later, he told Dr. Fontes, "That's when I knew I was at their mercy, whoever they were." Ask yourself, what would you do in this moment? Alone in a field, your only transportation dead, a strange craft hovering above you? Run, hide, or sit frozen, unable to process what your eyes are seeing because nothing in your experience has prepared you for this? The craft that landed wasn't your typical Hollywood flying saucer. This detail matters significantly. In 1957, the predominant cultural image of UFOs was the sleek, disc-shaped craft portrayed in films like The Day the Earth Stood Still.
We interrupt this program to give you a bulletin just received from one of our naval units at sea. A large object traveling at supersonic speed is headed over the North Atlantic toward the east coast of the United States.
What Antonio described was radically different. An egg-shaped vessel, approximately 10 to 7 meters in diameter. As it descended, he could make out its surface, metallic, with a reddish glow emanating from the front, and a silvery white light that rotated on the upper dome. The craft touched down on 3 metallic legs, kicking up a cloud of red dust. For several long minutes, Antonio sat frozen in his tractor seat. Then, movement. A rectangular opening appeared in the craft's side, not sliding or swinging open, but simply appearing, like a section of the hull had suddenly ceased to exist. Light spilled out, cutting a sharp geometric pattern across the field. Shadows emerged from the light, small figures stepping forward with a precision that sent chills down Antonio's spine. And through that rectangle of impossible light, he saw them. The beings that emerged moved with purpose, 3 of them approaching his tractor. Through the rectangle of light behind them, Antonio could see more figures moving inside the craft. He would later describe them with a level of detail that investigators found remarkable. Not vague shapes or generic aliens, but distinctive features. They stood approximately 1.6 meters tall, wearing tight-fitting gray suits with strange bands around major joint areas. Their helmets, and I want you to really visualize this, featured 3 silvery tubes that curved down to connect with a device on their backs. Through the clear front sections of their helmets, Antonio could see their eyes, round, blue, set wider apart than human eyes, watching him with an intensity that he would later describe as not hostile, but completely without emotion. This wasn't the vacant stare of a hallucination, it was the focused gaze of beings with intent. When they reached the tractor, one grabbed his arm. Antonio didn't think, he ran. His boots pounded against the loose soil, breath ragged, heart slamming against his ribs. He was almost free. So close. Then, a hand clamped down on his arm. Hard, too strong. Before he could rip away, another one grabbed him. Then another. He twisted, thrashed, kicked like his life depended on it, because it did. But it didn't matter. Their grip was unshakable, unnatural. Small hands, impossibly strong, clamped onto him like iron. And then, the worst part, his feet left the ground. He wasn't running anymore, he was being carried, dragged backward, weightless, helpless, as the craft loomed closer. Now, think about this. A moment ago, you were a farmer. Now, you're being dragged across a field by creatures that shouldn't exist. No one knows you're out here. No one's coming. Whatever happens next, you're on your own. For Antonio, the shock wasn't just that he was being taken. It was the sudden, complete inversion of his world. Hours earlier, he had been the decision maker on his family's farm, shouldering adult responsibility.
Now, he was powerless, being dragged across his own field toward a craft that shouldn't exist.
Inside the craft, everything changed, and I need you to understand, what Antonio was about to experience would become the template for thousands of abduction accounts in the decades that followed. But here's the thing, he described it first, before it became a pattern, before it became expected. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened next. Inside, everything felt wrong. The air carried a metallic tang, somewhere between ozone and chlorine. A low vibration pulsed through the floor. The walls smooth, seamless. The light no source, just glowing. Surrounding him, watching him. No joins in the walls, no visible fasteners, no evidence of manufacturing as he understood it. This wasn't just advanced technology, it was technology that operated on principles beyond his comprehension. The room they brought him to was circular, with a metallic center column that seemed to pulse with energy. Here, the beings communicated among themselves in sounds that Antonio described as barks and grunts. Not language as he understood it, but clearly conveying meaning between them. They stripped him. This wasn't done clinically, but with what seemed like curiosity. His clothes were examined, the fabric rubbed between fingers before being set aside. Antonio stood naked, shivering despite the room's moderate temperature, as the beings moved around him with purpose. What followed was a 4-hour ordeal that would forever divide Antonio's life into before and after. The beings covered his body with a clear, viscous fluid that caused his skin to redden significantly. Using glass instruments, they drew blood, specifically from his chin, a detail that would appear in countless abduction reports decades later, but was unprecedented in 1957. Dr. Olavo Fontes, the head of gastroenterology at the National School of Medicine and a consultant for the Brazilian military, would later examine Antonio and document persistent skin abnormalities consistent with radiation exposure. When shown photographs of radiation burns from nuclear test site workers, Dr. Fontes noted the striking similarities to the marks on Antonio's body. Throughout this examination, Antonio tried to communicate. He gestured, spoke, shouted in Portuguese. The beings showed no reaction to his voice, continuing their procedures with the detached interest of scientists examining a specimen. Then, the tone of the encounter shifted dramatically. The beings left, closing the door behind them. Though door isn't quite right, the opening simply ceased to exist, the wall becoming unbroken again. Antonio was alone for what he estimated to be 20 minutes, though time had become difficult to track. And just when you think this story couldn't get any stranger,
It definitely does.
when the wall opened again, she entered. This female entity would become the most controversial aspect of Antonio's account, yet also potentially the most significant in understanding the purpose behind these encounters. She appeared mostly human in form, similar height, similar proportions, but the differences were jarring. Hair, that Antonio described as blood red, covered much of her body. Her eyes had pointed outer edges, slanting upward in a way that no human eyes do. Her cheekbones were wide and high, her chin sharply pointed. What happened next was intimate. Unlike the clinical examination by the other beings, this encounter had a different purpose entirely. The female entity initiated sexual contact with Antonio, an aspect of the case that caused many researchers to dismiss it entirely. After all, it seemed too much like a fantasy, too convenient. But there's a critical detail most analysts miss. In 1957, the concept of alien-human hybridization wasn't part of any cultural narrative about extraterrestrials. It wouldn't emerge as a pattern in abduction accounts until decades later. Yet, here was Antonio, describing what appears to be a genetic sampling program before such a concept existed in public consciousness. Before leaving, she made 3 gestures that Antonio would never forget, pointing to her belly, then to him, and finally upward toward the stars. No words, just this simple pantomime that needed no translation. Those 3 gestures would haunt him for years. In 1978, when Dr. Jacques Vallée interviewed him, more than 20 years after the incident, Antonio revealed that he had experienced recurring dreams of children who looked partially human, but with distinctly alien features. Always watching Earth from a curved window in what seemed to be a spacecraft. Think about carrying that kind of secret for decades. What would you do if you had an experience so profound, so inexplicable, that sharing it would likely make people think you were crazy? Would you tell everyone? Would you keep it locked inside? Or would you, like Antonio, tell the truth once and then try to move on with your life? For Antonio, the aftermath was as difficult as the encounter itself. When he finally returned home after dawn, his family noticed immediate changes. His normally healthy appetite was gone. He became ill frequently. Strange marks appeared on his body days after the encounter, purplish bruises with no apparent cause. His brother, who had witnessed the strange lights with him weeks earlier, now kept his distance. The unspoken question hung between them. What if it had been me instead of you? Their mother noticed Antonio's new habit of checking the sky before going outside at night, a small gesture that spoke volumes about his lingering fear. When he finally shared his story with medical professionals and investigators on February 22, 1958. What's rarely mentioned in popular accounts is that military intelligence officers from 3 countries, Brazil, the United States, and surprisingly, the Soviet Union, attempted to interview Villas Boas within weeks of his report going public. Why would intelligence agencies from both sides of the Cold War take interest in a farmer's bizarre story unless there was something substantive about it? Most telling of all was Antonio's response to the sudden attention. he retreated from it. Journalists threw money at him for interviews. He shut them down. A publisher offered a book deal worth more than 3 years of farm work. He wasn't interested. That's not what this was about. I didn't ask for this to happen to me, he told a local reporter in one of his few public statements. I just want to be left alone. Instead of capitalizing on his story, Antonio did something remarkable. He saved money from the farm, moved to Sao Paulo, and put himself through law school, a stunning achievement for someone with his limited formal education. He became an attorney, married, had 4 children, all fully human, he would sometimes joke to close friends, and built a respectable career far from the spotlight. When investigators would occasionally find him over the years, his account never changed. Not in details, not in sequence, not in outcome. The consistency over decades is something that experienced investigators find compelling. Fabricated stories tend to evolve, embellish, adapt to new information. Antonio's remain like bedrock. He passed away in 1991, never having written a book, never having appeared on the UFO convention circuit, never having profited from his experience. His obituary in a Sao Paulo newspaper made no mention of the 1957 encounter, just a brief recounting of his legal career and surviving family members. That's either the worst way to cash in on a hoax, or exactly what you'd expect from someone who just wanted to report what really happened and move on with their life. Some skeptics say it was all an elaborate fabrication. Others, like former CIA operative Bosko Nenchelsevic, claimed it was a psychological warfare experiment. But that theory has serious holes in it. After examining declassified documents from Project Artichoke and MK Ultra, it's clear that in 1957, CIA operations in South America were focused almost exclusively on monitoring communist influences, not staging elaborate alien abductions of isolated farmers using technology that didn't exist. And this is where things get really weird. What makes this case truly extraordinary is how it fits into a pattern that stretches back through human history. The phenomenological consistency between Villas Boas' account and ancient encounters is striking. From the Sumerian tablets describing the Anunnaki's genetic manipulation of humans, circa 4000 BCE, to the medieval accounts of night visitors who performed physical examinations, the core experience remains eerily consistent across millennia. The only real difference? We've updated the language to match our technological understanding. Ancient cultures described these beings as gods descending in chariots of fire. Medieval accounts spoke of spirits and demons. Today we talk about extraterrestrials and advanced spacecraft. But the fundamental experience appears unchanged across human history. Some say the truth is out there, but after examining cases like Villas Boas, I've come to a different conclusion. The truth has been right here all along, documented meticulously in cases that appeared before cultural contamination could explain them. Cases that emerge across every culture, every continent, every era of human existence. The next time you're outside late at night and see a light moving in ways that defy explanation, remember Antonio Villas Boas. Remember that sometimes the visitors aren't just observing us from a distance. Sometimes they want something far more intimate, something written into the very code of our DNA. And somewhere among the stars, the descendants of that October night might still be watching, carrying within them the genetic legacy of humanity, a living bridge between our world and theirs. What if we're not searching for them? What if we're searching for us? A version of humanity that's already out there, watching, waiting, and maybe
They've been here the whole time.